Chapter 22. Adelaide experienced its wettest day in months. Thankfully, Andrew was able to rush off to the hardware store and buy a giant tarp to cover the garden. Pretty amazing for a man who only slept about 2 hours that night. The rains didn't keep everyone away, though, and we had a steady crowd coming through our mini market. As I looked around, I realized that I didn't recognize most of the faces there. It was incredible. So many people wanted to chat to me and tell me that they had read my article in the Advertiser. I was so brave to go to Cambodia like that with my family. They would love to do something similar, but would never be able to. I had an old lady grip onto my hand, saying she had always wished to help out in a poor country, but life had gotten in the way. Others thanking me for the article, which had inspired them to contribute on some level in their own local community. I hadn't realized that my article would impact so many people. It meant a lot that they took the time to tell me. It was also a great opportunity to see friends that we had missed since being away. I got a massive hug from Kaya, who was there helping me out. Her giant smile saying it all. She knew that it had all started with her cotton blouse only a few months earlier. Now she got to see what had been triggered by her visit to us in our Cambodian village. The day was a great success and felt more like a celebration than a sale. We all collapsed into bed that night, totally exhausted but happy. The next day, I was wheeled into theater for surgery. I had been told that it was a very straightforward operation. My friend who had had it done a few years earlier told me that it was really just like watching birds pulling out worms from the beach. I like that. Just another day at the beach. It actually hurt more than I expected, though. The incisions on my bikini line stretching as I tried to move. My legs were completely bandaged up, and I tried to take as few painkillers as possible since my gut doesn't seem to like them. I was still recovering in hospital when I took a call from a popular radio station. Would I be interested in an interview? I sure was. I figured the beauty of radio is that no one needed to know that I was still looking like an Egyptian mummy from my waist down. As it turned out, 2 radio stations wanted me to come in. It was a great opportunity to spread the word a bit wider about our project. We didn't have much planned for the rest of our 5 weeks in Australia. We would drive back to Melbourne once my legs were healed enough to last the 8-hour car trip. It'd be great to spend some time with Andrew's family again. I really wanted our kids to have a relationship with their auntie and grandfather. It would also be a good chance for us to get to know their grandpa's new wife, Judith, a bit better. I was really excited because Andrew's sister had agreed to having the kids stay for her for 2 nights. It would mean a mini getaway for me and Andrew, a much needed getaway. The whole point of us moving to Cambodia was to spend more time as a family. And even though things had been so busy and the sewing project had unfolded so unexpectedly that it was hard to make time for just the 2 of us. I booked a holiday house a couple of hours' drive from the Great Ocean Road. It was simple but perfect for us. 2 days alone, such a treat. It turned out to be a total disaster. What had been an incredibly beautiful drive there was now just a blur. The cliffs and the ocean hardly noticed, with tears streaming down my face. Andrew was crying as well, apologizing and crying. He had tried to blame me for something that was totally unrelated to me, his own shit. He tried to make it out that it was my fault, and it had backfired. I was so disgusted by his deceit. How had he sounded so convincing in his lies? That's what I couldn't get my head around, the lying. My own husband lying to me. What was it with me and lying husbands? I didn't really care that much about the topic itself. It was just how it was kept hidden from me, and then Andrew trying to blame me. It cut so deep. Our 2 days away that were meant to be a chance for us to reconnect had become the ugliest chapter in our relationship so far. It was devastating. Despite our now empty suitcases, I had never felt heavier, stepping back on the plane going back to Cambodia. Who was this man? I wasn't even sure if I wanted to know. He knew how much I craved the truth, knew that I had met his confession the first time we had a drink together at the pub in Aldgate with absolute kindness and warmth, knew that after living with my first husband, I needed a man who didn't keep things in the dark. I was at a complete loss as to what to do from here. I knew we needed counseling as a couple. We had needed that for years. Something had to change. Andrew's initial response after our 2 days away was total remorse, but it very quickly changed to him accusing me of being a bad wife. His words hurt, but he insisted he was right. I was uncaring, unloving, and obviously didn't need him. Need him. There it was again. He wanted me to need him. I asked him to explain. How exactly was I a bad wife? What was I doing that was so horrible? He didn't have much to say, but reminded me of the article that I had written for the paper. I had hardly mentioned him at all. Did he not matter to me? Here I was getting a story published in the paper and having radio interviews, and there was now talk about me going on a TV breakfast show as well. I obviously didn't need him. It made my brain hurt. Was this all about him being jealous? Was it even worth trying to respond to him? It all felt so immature. Our marriage was a complete and utter headfuck. I so desperately wanted it to work, but I had no idea if it was possible. In many ways, it seemed like it wouldn't take much for us to be transformed into a couple who could communicate without insecurities and judgments always being in the equation. Then at other times, it felt like I was wanting the impossible. I couldn't be the needy wife Andrew was wanting me to be. I just couldn't. I didn't need him. I would never need him. I wanted him, though. I really wanted him, but that wasn't enough for him. I was in Phnom Penh for a few days on my own, so I decided to do two things. One was make an appointment with a counselor. If he was any good, I would ask Andrew to join me. It was a huge amount of money for the session, but I knew we needed someone to help. I wasn't exactly sure how we would be able to get any future sessions together, but we would just have to make it a priority. I told Andrew that we needed to get support and transform our marriage, or we would need to divorce. I couldn't do this limbo land anymore where we would live in constant tension. One of the hardest things for me was that I really needed dialogue about what was going on. I hated the silence around it. Andrew, on the other hand, felt too confronted with that. He thought that my writing emails to him was better so he could take his time responding. That was fine because it meant that I could write and cry and not feel bad that my tears would make Andrew feel uncomfortable. It was so frustrating to not be able to speak from the heart without the crying. However, the emails meant long delays where I had to wait for Andrew to respond. It was so hard to play happy families while waiting for his email to show up in my inbox. It was doing my head in. One day he would be remorseful and tell me how bad he would feel about how he was criticizing Asher because of the connection I had with him. Only then the very next day he would be mocking me for being too concerned about Asher's feelings. I couldn't make any sense of it. The other thing I did in Phnom Penh was buy a book. I had seen an article about it and was intrigued. It was a book about oral sex. I ended up buying another book as well, just so I could cover up the one about oral sex. It felt so weird buying a book like that. But I was desperate. Something needed to change. I was craving playfulness. We had been in such a heavy headspace for so long, and maybe it was all too complex to try to discuss and come to resolution. Maybe we could just have some fun and find a way to connect in the bedroom. Andrew was appalled. A book about oral sex? Why would he want to be told by someone else what to do with his wife? I was practically inviting someone else into our bedroom. After flicking through a few pages of the book, he handed it back to me and said he wasn't interested. I was back to square one. In the midst of us trying to get our marriage to some sort of functional level, we decided that we would continue with the sewing project for a while longer since it was getting so much positive attention. When the word spread that I was running a sewing project, everyone seemed to ask me if I knew the lady who ran a knitting project in Phnom Penh. I didn't. Besides Sarah, who was now living in Phnom Penh, I didn't know anyone there. Once I got a chance to meet Monica, the lady with the knitting project, I understood why everyone kept insisting I get in touch with her. She was just the person I needed to connect with. She had lived in Cambodia long enough to understand the ins and outs of the place. She not only spoke the language, but was also married to a local. On top of all that, she was witty and seemed to understand my warped sense of humor. What a relief. I was pretty desperate for like-minded people, and it felt good to add her to my list of people who could make me laugh. I now had two in Cambodia, Sarah and Monica. It was a nice change from my ever-growing list of people who were making my life difficult. Monica had a great knitting project going on. She was teaching marginalized women, as well as a couple of men, how to knit. She would provide all the training as well as the supplies, and then pay them a very fair wage. It meant that they were able to earn an income, and not have to be away from their children, which was so often the case. I really liked her products, but wasn't sure if I would be able to sell them for her. The knitted monsters that she had were adorable, but way too big for me to try to lug back to Australia with my bags already full of goodies. Her finger puppets were super cute as well, but I'd always struggled with finger puppets. I could never seem to keep track of them, and before I knew it, they were lost in the abyss. I really wanted to support her somehow, but it might mean coming out with a new product. My life was so hectic, but there was something about being in a tuk-tuk that helped me in my creative process. Most of my ideas were birthed while riding in a tuk-tuk behind Nara. On yet another Phnom Penh visit, I was mulling over how I could help Monica out. I felt as if there was an idea ready to come to life. I just couldn't grasp it yet. There was something about her monkey finger puppets that appealed to me. I kept coming back to their cute little faces. What if we used them somehow? Would we be able to get them into a proper little monkey with long arms and legs? I knew they would look great, but how could I work that into an item to sell with one of my products? Of course, my shopping bags. If we rolled up my shopping bags, we could have a monkey grab around it with his arms. They would just need to attach somehow, but how could we do that? I quickly sent a text to Monica explaining my latest tuk-tuk revelation, asking her if she had access to any magnets. She responded straight away saying she didn't have any magnets, but if I could find some at the market, she was sure they could be knitted into the monkeys. I called out to Nara over the noise of the traffic that we needed to stop at the large market instead of going to the guest house. No problem, but first you need a coconut. Nara knew me well. We ended up spending half a day in the crowded markets on our magnet quest, each stallholder sending us in a different direction through the dark maze to find these elusive magnets. Nara and I had already been on many of these adventures before, trying to source buttons and zippers. I was so grateful to have a tuk-tuk driver that was happy to support me in my random requests. By now, it was dark, but we drove across town to drop off the magnets to Monica. There wasn't a moment to spare. I wanted to see these monkeys come to life now. A week later, Monica told me that she had the first monkey ready and she paid for him to be delivered to our house. I was so excited to open up a small package and behold the creation. My kids were surrounding me, waiting for the big moment, and all burst out laughing when they saw our new little friend. He was cute, but he sure didn't look anything like a monkey. His arms and legs were so short, and he could hardly reach over his head in order for his hands to connect. He was doing a very good impersonation of a chubby bear. I called Monica, and I explained that the monkey in my head had much longer arms and legs. A few days later, a long-limbed monkey showed up at our house, and he was perfect. My mother was able to fly over from Sweden for a visit. Despite the madness, it was great to have her come and see us. I love having a mother who had no concerns about jumping on a plane to Cambodia. She had no questions about safety or illness or anything like that. I wasn't sure how many women in their 60s would be the same. We decided to use her visit as an excuse to travel up to Siem Reap and check out Angkor Wat and the other temples. We were constantly being asked if we had been there yet. Cambodians were so proud of their ancient temples, and to have lived in their country for almost a year now and still not go there was borderline offensive. Jo had been telling me about her friend in Geelong who had moved to Siem Reap for 6 months to volunteer at a school for homeless kids. According to Jo, I would love Kat, and she was there with her husband and their 3 daughters. I had promised I would get in touch with them if we decided to travel north. There was no way we were going to go to Siem Reap without bringing Rosa with us. This was such a great opportunity for her to explore Angkor Wat. Rosa's younger sister wanted to come as well, and if she was coming, we figured we might as well invite Srenet, the girl who would come most days and sit at our house and watch the sewing ladies. She was the youngest of 3 sisters. Her dad had died when she was little, and now her mom was trying to raise 3 daughters on her own. They were the poorest family in our village. It would be an amazing opportunity for Srenet to travel to Siem Reap and see the beloved temples. The 10 of us traveled up by bus and taxi. The 2 young girls from our village were excited yet nervous about being away from home. They had hardly ever even been to Kampot, the town closest to us. Now they were going to Angkor Wat. We booked 3 rooms in a guest house. It was nicer than the ones we had stayed in Phnom Penh because it had air conditioning. I knew this would be so strange for Srenet, sleeping in a bed, having a TV. I had never been inside her home, but it was a rickety shack on stilts held together with pieces of scrap metal. Bigger holes were covered up with old rice bags. The ground beneath them never seemed to dry out, even in the hottest month. They still had to walk in mud to get to their ladder. Their home was exactly opposite the noodle shack that was open every morning, so if they wanted any privacy, they would need to go out while it was still dark and do their business behind a small bush next to their shack. What would a week of staying in a hotel room do for Srenet? I wasn't really comfortable about it. Andrew was happy to play guide and took the clan out each morning to explore. I tagged along when I could, but it was hard for Sage in the heat. I would stay back with her in summer and enjoy the pool and try and do some shorter outings with them. It was great to finally meet Kat and her family. I knew why Jo had said I would love her. We instantly hit it off. I loved her positivity. She had this very calm presence and seemed to have time to draw despite being busy with motherhood. I really liked her drawing style and started to mull over the idea of her helping me out with one of the sewing projects. Rosa had told me that there were two girls from our village who were going to find work in a local factory. They were only 16. I hated the thought of these two girls in a sweatshop. It would very likely be one that made shoes. Most of the local girls worked there. I could smell the fumes from the glue a few streets away. I really wanted to keep them away from having to work in a place like that, yet I didn't really know how to give them any work. Now that I was watching Kat draw, I started to come up with an idea. What if we could teach the girls how to embroider? That would be much easier to learn than sewing. If we could teach them that, we could maybe get some little things made, ornaments of sorts, and sell them to pay their wages. I told Kat I had this image of angels from different cultures. Could she draw some, and then I could get them printed onto fabric, and the girls could embroider over the lines. Kat got right to it and asked me what sort of cultures I was wanting. In the end, we had an African angel carrying a basket, a Russian angel carrying a star, a Cambodian angel with a sarong holding a lotus flower, and I couldn't resist having one from Israel. We had her wearing sandals with a baby wrapped to her chest. They were gorgeous. Kat had totally understood what I wanted, and I was so excited to get the images printed out. It was great to add these to my collection of things to sell. I was going back to Adelaide in just over a month, and I would have quite a few new items in my collection. The other products I wanted to add to my new Adelaide sale was silk scarves. Cambodian markets are full of scarves, and I hadn't really been paying attention to them. I was only wanting to sell things that were happily made, as I like to call it. I wasn't able to use the fair trade label, since it cost money to get that certification. And sadly, in Cambodia, it didn't necessarily mean anything ethical. I started referring to my items for sale as happily made in Cambodia. I figured that would speak for itself. Only things ethically made with or without the fair trade label. When I first noticed the scarves, I assumed they were mass-produced like everything else. However, they weren't. They were designed for the French boutique market and amazingly had the ethical stamp of approval. When I spoke to the young man designing the scarves, he invited me to come and visit the village where they were made, just an hour's drive outside Siem Reap. This was a great opportunity to go and visit them and see for myself. Rosa wanted to come along, which was great because I really needed her for translation. Her English was still very simple, but with me not having improved in my Khmer language department at all, I was totally at a loss without her. I had tried to learn Khmer, but gave up very quickly. I couldn't even form the sounds with my tongue, let alone say them. And maybe I was tone deaf, but I couldn't in any way decipher the two words that sounded identical to me, but supposedly had different meanings altogether. It created a lot of laughter when I attempted to speak Khmer, but I could never be understood. I blamed the heat. It was just so hot all the time. So to try to add learning a language into my already full existence was too much for me. My mother also wanted to come along to the Silk Village to see how the scarves were made. The trip was much longer than we expected, and the road was actually worse than Uterus Road, which I didn't think was possible. We eventually got to the tiny village. It was hard to imagine anything beautiful being made there. It was just a few rows of houses in a very dusty part of northern Cambodia. We were told to come in under one of the houses on stilts. A massive woven tray filled with leaves had all these silkworms munching away. We looked around, and there hanging from the ceiling were bunches of twigs. When we looked closer, we could see the cocoons clinging on, fluffy, bright yellow cocoons. Outside the house, this old lady, who really looked like she had celebrated her 100th birthday a while back, was sitting by a spinning wheel. I thought it was a spinning wheel, but when I walked up to her, I realized it was a bicycle wheel that was now being used to form the silk threads. An old paint tin filled with water was boiling away with the cocoons in it, smoke rising above us. I was in awe of what she was able to do with so little. This golden thread growing longer and longer in front of me. Under another house, two girls were using the bicycle wheels to make bowls of string. Young women were weaving on giant rickety looms. They were creating the most intricate patterns with the silk string. I was speechless. It was all so beautiful and done in such a quiet way. It felt so right to order a whole bunch of scarves from them and be able to sell them in Australia, knowing where they had been made. It truly was magical. Our finances were at a really critical point by now. Andrew had decided to look for some work back in Australia and flew there after our visit to Siem Reap. I didn't like being in Cambodia on my own with the kids, but a few weeks later we joined him in Adelaide. It felt good being back as a family. Things were hard between me and Andrew, but I knew that our kids were happiest when all of us were together. Being back in Adelaide meant that I could have another sale, and this time I had also organized 2 movie fundraisers, one in Sydney and one in Adelaide. By now I had been asked to write another article for the Advertiser because there was such a huge response from the first one. People were contacting me offering their help. I had this idea of asking people to host an evening where I could come along and speak about what we were doing in Cambodia and talk about some of the things we were helping with and see if people wanted to be involved in raising funds for different causes I was mentioning. I had quite a few of these evenings lined up. I would bring along a couple of suitcases full of hand-woven scarves and sell them. I was noticing that my back was getting sore and sore. Sometimes it would take me a while to straighten up after sitting and driving in the car was hurting my back. I had struggled with lower back pain since having kids, so this was nothing new to me. Having lived in Cambodia for over a year and not driving a car the whole time, I could tell that sitting in the car seat was not helping my back in any way. Each drive, it seemed to get worse. I was starting to get concerned because I knew I had a flight coming up to Sydney for the next movie night, and I still had a few more scarf parties to speak at. Someone suggested that I go see a kinesiologist. They would be able to help me with my ongoing back issues and get to the source of the pain. My appointment was scheduled for a few days later, and I arrived hoping to finally get some relief. The lady seemed nice and explained that she taught kinesiology at the local college. She asked me to lie down on her table. She felt my hip bones and straight away told me that one of my legs was shorter than the other. I was impressed, you could tell. It was something that others had needed an x-ray to confirm. She started feeling my pulse. A bit strange, I thought. I would just let her do her thing. She asked me if I was sensitive to smells. Yes, both me and my dad are very sensitive to smells. She kept going, asking me more and more bizarre questions, now telling me that I had a very strong connection to both of my grandmothers, one in particular. How weird. She asked me to look from side to side and blink over and over while she gently moved my knees from side to side. Then I had to take deep breaths while she straightened my legs, one at a time. Everything she did was slow and gentle and nothing hurt. I was more focused on the strange questions or comments she had. She went on to tell me that I wasn't getting the support I needed and that my body was very much in flight or fight response. The session finished and I drove back to where we were staying in the city. I felt consumed with sleep and collapsed on our mattress as soon as I got home. I woke up a couple of hours later after a very heavy sleep. As I tried to get up, I realized I couldn't use my legs. This severe pain shot down from my pelvis to my feet. I laid back down thinking it might go away. After about 20 minutes, I tried again. Still the same. I was in total agony. For 3 days, I needed help to drag myself to the toilet. Eventually, Andrew and Asher helped me down the 3 flights of stairs so I could go to a doctor and get some pain relief. It was so scary. I had no idea how the gentle movements at the kinesiologist could have in any way triggered this to happen. After a couple of visits to Adrienne, my chiropractor, and lots of ice packs, I was back to walking again, but still in pain. I had to cancel my trip to Sydney and couldn't go to the fundraiser there. I was at a total loss as to what I could do. Thankfully, my friend Izzy stepped in and offered to help me with the Adelaide movie night that was coming up. She was a relatively new friend, and I was so touched by her help. Her daughter Violet and Tikva had met while learning to fire twirl with Astrid a couple of years earlier. On our last visit to Adelaide, the girls had come up with the idea of how they could raise some money for the kids in Cambodia. They started selling these little jars of perfume, a concoction of leaves and flowers that supposedly smelled amazing. They decided to call their project 3 Jars Full, and had thankfully moved on from selling homemade perfume to now selling baked goodies and treats. Despite how young they were actually very good at baking, and all their items sold. They decided to use the money to buy educational toys for the preschools in Cambodia. Emma, our playgroup teacher in Kampot, had told Tikva how she volunteered for an organization that ran preschools in poor villages and how the kids didn't have anything to play with. It was great being able to use the money from Violet and Tikva to buy wooden blocks, puzzles, and other educational toys. We knew from how much our sewing ladies liked playing with our puzzles that it was such a treat to have something so basic that we took for granted. Having Izzy take over for me with the movie night was a massive relief. I loved her easy nature and how she really seemed to want to help. I didn't get that response from many friends, and it meant a lot to me when I was in such a difficult spot with my back not cooperating. As well as Izzy offering to help, I had a message from someone on Facebook called Beck. She said she knew about me from friends that we had in common, and that she was really keen to help out with anything I might need. Was there anything she could do? Yes, there was so much that needed to be done. I organized to meet with her at a cafe late one night once the kids were asleep. Beck asked if she could bring her housemate Ash, who was also really interested in what we were doing. Here were these two young women who didn't know me but were totally willing to help out. I liked them straight away. Not only did I need lots of practical help for everything I was trying to do, but more than that, I really needed friends. My time in Adelaide felt so incredibly lonely. Things with Andrew were so damn intense, I needed distraction. They knew my back was bad, so we mostly spent time watching crappy TV shows and drinking tea together, the perfect escape from my complex life. It was disappointing to have to cancel the rest of the scarf parties. I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to women directly about the sewing project. Most of them mothers. Most of them juggling so many things, yet so many of them feeling helpless when it came to the poverty around the world. I loved sharing with them simple ideas of how we could do something from the comforts of our own life. It really didn't take much to change someone's life in a developing country. I encouraged them to find their own way of contributing in their workplace or schools, to have a tin for everyone who put $1 in once a week. That tiny amount could easily pay for a student in Cambodia to go to school. Often it's something as simple as a bike that's needed to get them there, or a uniform. For everyone who was renovating or extending their house, I would encourage them to spend a fraction of what they spent on their kitchen, for example, and use that money to pay for a community garden to be set up, and in turn that would help feed a village. I really wanted people to see that it wasn't a huge amount of money that was needed, just to spare a few coins on a regular basis. The message was getting through, and I started receiving emails from these women about what they were changing in their lives. One woman asked all her family and friends to give some money instead of a gift for her son's first birthday. Another woman said that when she had her weekly coffee with her group of friends, they all put in $2 to pay a teacher's wage. No one had to pack up their house and move to a poor country. No one had to really make any sacrifices. Yet so much goodness could come from people understanding that a lot of people doing very little can make a huge difference. Andrew and I had agreed that once we got back to Adelaide, we would get some counseling together. Andrew would start while I was in Cambodia with the kids. Then I would join him later. Thankfully, Andrew really connected with the counselor and enjoyed his sessions with her. Once I met with her as well, I realized that I was very much stepping in on his territory. Their sessions together were very productive, and it was probably best if they continued with Andrew going alone. He had a lot of stuff to deal with, and the marriage issues were almost too early to tackle yet. I did go along to a couple of sessions, despite the ongoing issues with my back. I had intended to go to more, but the pain really made it difficult to be there. I struggled listening to Andrew talking about our marriage. He seemed to think that he was the victim somehow, that he was married to this cold-hearted woman who yelled at him. It really stung. After our disastrous weekend away, I had told Andrew that I could no longer initiate conversation about our marriage. I just couldn't anymore. I felt numb, and the waiting game was too hard for me. Andrew agreed that he needed to be the one who started the dialogue and promised he would. I was exhausted from being in Cambodia on my own with the kids. I hated being a solo parent there. The responsibility was enormous. The kids were still getting sick a lot, and it terrified me that I didn't have the backup of another adult. I needed to put the marriage stuff to the side and just let Andrew initiate when he was ready. Of course he didn't. When I finally asked him why, he told me it was because I was being cold. Cold? I wasn't being affectionate enough with him. Not tender, not soft. I tried to explain that I was hurt. I was numb. That was very different from being cold. He had agreed that he needed to drive the communication, and then when he didn't, I was blamed for it. Was there no room for me to just crash and burn somewhat? Could he not in any way see that I needed him to show that this was just as important to him as to me? How dare he call me cold? I was numb, and for very good reasons, too. And only a couple of months before he had acknowledged that. Yet now, to our counselor, he was making me out to be a heartless bitch. The one thing that really made the counseling sessions worth it for me personally was that I was finally validated in my communication style. Andrew accused me of yelling at him when I spoke from the heart, despite the fact that I didn't raise my voice. The intensity scared him, and he called it yelling. Thankfully, our counselor was married to a Croatian man, and she explained to Andrew that it was very common for Anglos who had spouses from other cultures to feel intimidated by the intensity. It wasn't anger and it wasn't screaming, it was just someone being passionate. I wasn't sure if Andrew accepted what she said. His mother was the most meek and mild woman who never spoke about her needs. In the little time I knew her, I saw her on so many occasions biting her tongue instead of speaking out. She didn't feel like she could say what she wanted to say. Andrew hated that about her. It was something that attracted him to me, that I wasn't like his mother. He liked a strong woman, yet now that he had an outspoken wife, he despised me for it. The plan was that I was going to return to Cambodia with the children after the movie fundraiser. I tried to tell Andrew that I couldn't return. It really scared me. My back was still so delicate, and the thought of the plane trip alone was enough for me to say I couldn't do it. Andrew tried to tell me that Asher and Tikva could help with the luggage while I handled the girls. I wasn't quite sure how he imagined that would work. Just me putting our luggage into the overhead compartment on the plane could trigger my back pain. Not to mention me handling Sage on my own if she had one of her many tantrums. All that aside, I was scared of being in Cambodia with the kids on my own. They were still getting sick a lot, and I hated to be the only parent there for that. We also kept having all these mysterious ailments where the girls would wake up with sharp pain during the night and just scream and scream. I couldn't do that on my own anymore. Thankfully, Andrew agreed that we could stay on in Adelaide for longer, at the same time reminding me that it was going to cost a lot more for our family to be here than in Cambodia. And the whole reason he was in Adelaide was to make some money. I knew that, but I also knew that I couldn't travel. It was unfortunate, but I couldn't do it. I was sorry, but we had to wait until at least my back was stronger. Andrew seemed frustrated at my weakness, and I was hurt by his lack of concern. We'd been living with a young couple in the city, but with us now staying longer, we needed to find another place. Incredibly, a woman that I didn't know that well offered for us to stay with her and her family in Henley Beach, just down the road from where I had gotten married all those years earlier. We had met each other from the homeschool network, and she knew we needed a place to stay. I was so touched by her hospitality. She was a busy woman with 3 children of her own, one still being breastfed. Here she was, inviting a family of 6 to live with her. Nicole and her husband felt very strongly about the importance of community, and I was in awe of the integrity they had in that. I couldn't think of too many couples with 3 children who would feel comfortable about a family coming to live with them, a family with lots and lots of suitcases. Our belongings were overflowing, all the items we were selling as well as the bits and pieces we needed for our daily life. Nicole seemed to take it all in her stride. I was so aware that we were not the easiest house guests. So many of us, me with my dodgy back, which meant lots of resting and not being able to help with much. Andrew away at work for the day. Nicole didn't seem to mind. She kept doing her thing. She had all these concoctions going in her kitchen and her pantry. I would watch her pound cabbage into a jar, explaining that she was making sauerkraut because it was good for the gut. The gut? I remembered something my doctor had said about eating foods to heal the gut. She had wanted me to cook broths for summer. Supposedly the bones were exactly what the gut needed to heal. I did it once and the whole house stank and the kids didn't like it. It was something I kept meaning to do again, but it never happened. Here was Nicole making sauerkraut, and when I asked her about it, she went into her pantry and returned with a strange-looking drink. She asked me if I'd ever heard of kombucha. Of what? No, I hadn't. I had a sip. Later, when Andrew got home, he tried some too and said it tasted like the bottom of the compost bin. He was right. That's exactly what it tasted like. Nicole laughed and said that maybe it was a bit neglected and a bit too potent, but it was still good. She tried to drink it daily. Along with that, her kids didn't seem to eat any fruit. It really intrigued me. Here I was making sure that my kids had an endless supply of fruit. Apples, oranges, grapes, and bananas were being devoured. Nicole's kids seemed to eat cucumbers between meals, or expensive tins of sustainable fish. If they ever mentioned that they were hungry, Nicole would get them to drink raw milk. So much of it every day. It went against everything I knew about being healthy. Surely fruit was the best thing for kids to eat as a snack. And milk? I thought it was best to avoid it. Nicole explained to me that she was trying to have her kids avoid sugar, even sugar in fruit. And raw milk had so many nutrients and good fats that were essential for kids. What she said made sense, but it felt like it was something too hard to even contemplate while in transit. I was very much just trying to keep my head above water, and introducing a new way of eating seemed way too complex. My new friend Beck was starting to ask me more details about some of the things I was involved with in Cambodia. She was really interested in coming back with us and helping out somehow. She was an occupational therapist who specialized in children with disabilities. I told her about Stephanie and her children and how she'd been thrown into the deep end with giving therapy to all the kids who were being carried to her house. To have someone like Beck come along to help out would be incredible. After a few emails back and forth between Beck and Stephanie, it was decided that she would come with us to Cambodia. I was more than happy to have her come and live with us in our house, and then she could ride her bike across to Stephanie's house and help there for a few hours a day. I was thrilled that Stephanie would get some professional help and relieved that I would have someone else in my house with Andrew away so much. I still felt incredibly intimidated about being in Cambodia without Andrew. My back had improved, but it was still flaring up from just the tiniest triggers. Our girls were going to a little preschool that had been set up with some of our friends from the playgroup. Rosa would take them on Andrew's moto each morning, the girls asking to sit side saddle like the locals. Asher and Tikva were not happy to be back in Cambodia. Asher missed his friends in the Adelaide Hills, two homeschool brothers that he would spend hours with in the backyard, making traps and climbing trees. He would spend days at a time with his friends, and when I picked him up, I could see the disappointment in his face. This was the one place where he could have friends. Tikva was also enjoying spending time with the friends she had in Adelaide. She adored Alice's kids that felt more like cousins than friends. And of course, there was Violet as well. Now we were back in Cambodia, and I could feel their loneliness. I had to find them some friends. I had to be more available to them. As much as this sewing project was great, and over time it could probably become something quite amazing, I was no longer able to do both. I couldn't be a mother as well as run this nonprofit sewing project without the support of others. Once I realized that the project was becoming bigger than just selling items on our first Australia trip in March 2010, I had asked Rosa to tell the sewing ladies that if they wanted to continue with the sewing, I would support them in making it their own project. I would love for one of them to step up to be trained to take over from my role. I would teach them what sort of fabrics to look for in the markets, and we could figure out which products were the best sellers and stick to those. I was happy to do the marketing and sales, but it would be wonderful for these women to have a bit more ownership and have it run more like a co-op for them to grow. Not one of them was interested. They liked it the way it was. They could come in the morning, sew, have lunch, sew, and go home. They would often come early so they could play with our puzzles on the floor. They loved that, but nothing more. They had no desire to work for themselves, and it made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't like being the white lady boss who had a room full of Cambodians working for me. I really wanted it to be a communal project and eventually something of their own. That uncomfortable feeling had started to grow. It kept growing as I realized that these women coming into my home each day were behaving like young children, taking food and then blaming Sreenet, the girl that had come with us to Siem Reap. I asked Rosa to call for a meeting, and we all sat in a circle on the floor. I explained that this was a home. I lived here with my children. I had invited them to come and work here, but it was also my home, not a factory. I needed to be able to trust them. If they wanted food, they could tell me, and I would be able to buy them food, but I couldn't have them taking things from my home. Each one of them insisted that Sreenet had taken the food. It wasn't just one occasion. The other times I had assumed that I was just imagining things. This time I had returned from yet another medical visit in Phnom Penh to an empty fruit bowl when we had nothing else to eat until the next morning. I looked at Rosa, trying to tell these women that it wasn't good what they were doing. That was one of the few things I could say in Khmer. Ot la'o, no good. I was saying it all the time. When my kids were getting pinched, when our neighbor kept smacking her toddler for no reason, just laughing and smacking this tiny child, I had yelled it at a tuk-tuk driver in Phnom Penh who had promised he would take me to a medical clinic when Summer had gone floppy in the middle of the night. She could hardly breathe, and the hotel insisted that they would not be able to call an ambulance. A tuk-tuk would be faster. I made sure they asked the driver if he knew where the medical clinic was. He assured us he did. I had jumped in the back of the tuk-tuk with Summer in my arms. I had to leave my 3 kids in a hotel room by themselves. Tikva agreeing to lie down next to Sage in case she woke up. I was still really unfamiliar with Phnom Penh. But when we arrived at the river, I knew that this bastard of a driver had lied to me. When he asked the man walking past where the clinic was, I just lost it. Ot la'o, ot la'o. That was all I could say. I jumped out of the tuk-tuk, Summer still totally pale and floppy. Thankfully, I found another tuk-tuk with a driver who could speak English and knew where to take us. Poor Rosa. She was out of her depth. It shouldn't be her role to discipline these women. Most of them were older than her. She was just a young village girl. It was not in her place to show any authority to someone older than her. I knew she was approached by women in our village who wanted to work with us, and I knew it was hard for her to say that they couldn't. Even though I was the white lady boss, I was the mute. I had no language, so Rosa became my mouthpiece, and these women would take their aggression out on her instead of me. How much was her role with us screwing things up for her in her life in the village down the track? Once we left Cambodia, what would the long-term implications be for Rosa? When I talked to her about it, she insisted that it didn't matter. She was okay. She wanted me to know, though, that it wasn't just stealing of food what was going on. Any time I left the house, the sewing ladies would start turning on all the lights around the house. Like school children being naughty, they thought it was some sort of revenge at authority to get our power bill as high as possible. I knew that Cambodians were young for their age. Andrew and I would talk about it all the time. Even Rosa, who we both adored and cared about, was so incredibly young. She was 21 in actual years, but really had the maturity of a 12-year-old. Andrew and I would roll our eyes at all the many things she said. When I had emailed Andrew and told him something that Rosa had done that had bothered me, his response was, "What would you expect from a 13-year-old?" I really didn't like having to put her in a place where she would be getting grief from people in her village. It wasn't right. I might have felt different if Andrew was here to help with the load, but I just couldn't do it all. I had to pull back. My kids needed their mother. Lots of people could step in and do the work I was doing for the sewing project. In fact, it probably needed quite a few people for the many hats I was wearing. But no one else could step in to be my kid's mother. The sewing project would have to finish up. I had nothing more to give. In many ways, I loved doing it, but it just got too much. My role as the rich white lady in our village was drawing more attention. I tried to explain that it wasn't the case at all. In fact, our money was at rock bottom. Of course, no one could see that with us living in a massive house and me arriving back from shopping trips with huge bags. According to our village, we must be loaded. Just me having white skin meant that I was rich. So for me to live the way I did meant that I obviously had lots of money. It meant frequent visits from the local police hoping to get bribes from me. A whole bunch of men in uniform would come and visit and say I needed to pay money for running a business. I tried to explain that I wasn't making any profit at all. They insisted they needed money. I had been told from some friends in town that even giving them office supplies would help. A block of A4 paper for the printer and more staples. Unfortunately, I didn't have any. The policemen would sit on a front step for ages, smoking, playing footsies, giggling, and pushing each other around like little primary school boys, waiting for their class to begin. Only they were man-sized and had cigarettes. They eventually went on their way when I asked Rosa to go and buy them all an iced coffee each and some fried rice. The iced coffee lady was only a few houses down. She had this tiny room with blackened walls, old ceramic pots that had obviously been around before the war, and possibly not washed since before the war. It was the ugliest little place you could imagine, and she made the most incredible coffee in the world. This thick syrup that tasted like magic. I had never been a coffee drinker until I was stuck in Cambodia on my own with 4 kids. Rosa had one every day, and in a moment of desperation, I had asked her to buy one for me as well. That was it. I couldn't stop. It was the highlight of my day. If I resisted waiting till later in the day, I would have 2. This stuff was incredible. I was sure I was only getting through my crazy life because of this dark brown elixir. So it seemed like the obvious thing to buy for the police as well as the fried rice from the medical clinic on Uterus Road. Conveniently, the village doctor also sold fried rice between waiting for patients. I thought that it would be hard to stop the sewing project and I would miss it after working on it for a year. I didn't, not for one moment. I hadn't realized how much it had been bothering my kids. I had been so happy making a difference, feeling like I was contributing, being part of the solution, having a purpose, that in the midst of that I had been turning away from the comments from the kids. I realized that I could probably be a better help if I just supported projects that were already up and running. I had no idea how to run a business. And even if this was non-profit, it was still a business and I was clueless. I was too nice I was too nice about it, wanting to pay wages that were too high and make the prices too low. Also, I had to be honest with myself. I was finding it too hard to deal with the locals. They were driving me nuts. I could blame the heat or my exhaustion or not having Andrew there, but really, they were just driving me crazy. One of the dads in the preschool had tried to warn me. He had lived in Cambodia for a long time, and initially I really struggled with his cynicism. He seemed so cold-hearted in a way. I vowed I would never become like him. When I first met him, he had told me that Westerners who decided to live in Cambodia can be divided up into 3 categories: merchants, missionaries, or misfits. I had thought to myself that surely there were more categories. But the longer I spent in Cambodia, I realized that Simon was right. Every expat I came across could basically slot into one of those 3 categories. I knew that Andrew and I well and truly landed in the misfits box. No matter how much we wanted to fit in with our friends back in Adelaide, we never would. We were too opinionated, our soapbox made people feel uncomfortable, but really the main thing was that we would always be seen as newcomers. Our friends had known each other since birth. Their parents knew each other. Heck, some of them were even related a few generations back. Andrew and I couldn't compete with that. We would never be part of the inner circle. We would hover around the edges, hoping to be allowed in. Here in Cambodia, we would never fit in either. We would forever be the white people, but it was more defined. There was something comforting about that, at least for me. Letting go of the sewing project was such a relief and a huge burden off my back. It had obviously taken its toll on me, and I hadn't even realized how much. There had been so many dramas unfolding that it was hard to tell what was what. At one point, not long before, I had been accused of child trafficking. It was outrageous. I received a phone call warning me. Through a series of very innocent events, I had been seen as a child smuggler, and the police were very likely coming to my house to bring me in for questioning at the local station. I was horrified that my actions could be interpreted that way, and that there was a chance of me ending up in jail and very likely not being released without some exorbitant amount of money being handed over. Apparently, it happened a lot in Cambodia. I had called up Andrew crying, not knowing what I should do. If I got in a taxi with the kids and fled to Phnom Penh, it would look as if I was guilty. If I stayed, my kids might not have a mother and would be stuck without a parent until Andrew flew back from Australia. All that had happened was that a man who rode his bike through our village every few days selling ice cream had told Rosa that a young woman up the road was going to sell her baby after she fell pregnant to a barong. Was I interested in buying the little boy? I was horrified at the thought of this young mom being so desperate that she would sell her baby to a stranger. I told the ice cream man to tell the young woman that she shouldn't sell her baby. There were other ways of getting help. A couple of days later, he returned saying that she had decided she would sell the baby. She had been offered $300 from someone. I asked Rosa to take me there. I got on the back of the moto, Rosa's long hair whipping me in the face. We often traveled like this. I knew it would look hilarious with the tom-tom white lady behind this tiny Cambodian girl. Me sitting like a man and not side saddle like women should. Uterus Road was way too bumpy for me to even attempt side saddle. We arrived only a few minutes later. Their hut was small, but still nicer than many I'd seen. They were cooking on an open fire and had a chicken cut up ready to go into the soup. They couldn't be that poor if they could afford meat. A baby was asleep in a hammock. He was absolutely gorgeous. Rosa helped me talk with the young mother. I introduced myself and explained that I couldn't buy her baby, but if she insisted on giving her baby away, she should go through a proper organization. There were even places in Kampot that would take her baby, and she could come and visit whenever she wanted. That way her son would still have a mother. She explained that she wanted money. If her baby was a girl, she would keep her, but not a boy. A boy was a waste of money. Eventually, he would marry and go and live with his wife's family. She hadn't heard about organizations that took babies, but unless she would be paid to put him there, she wasn't interested. Did I want to hold him? No, I didn't. I wasn't exactly sure why, but I felt that I needed to keep my distance somehow. I wanted to help this little boy so much, but at the same time, I had to be careful. Not just that, if I held him, I would probably never want to put him down. How could anyone possibly discard a beautiful little boy like this? I asked if I could take some photos. I explained that if she did decide to give him away, I wanted him to have some images of where he came from. I wanted him to see how his mother held him. I thought back to the orphans in Sri Lanka and how much they would value having photos of themselves as babies being cared for by their birth mother. The baby boy was being breastfed and he was holding onto his mother's hair. I wanted him to know that when he grew up. I wanted him to see how his grandmother would swing the hammock back and forth to rock him to sleep, the chickens pecking beneath. Would she please give him to an organization in Kampot instead of selling him, and then I could go there and give them the photos for him to have when he was older. We left without me really knowing what she would decide. I felt that I couldn't say anything else. I had tried. The only other thing I could think of was asking a couple in Phnom Penh who wanted a baby if they would consider adopting him. I knew that adoption laws were tricky, but maybe they could figure out a way to do it. I didn't really know them well, but they had seemed so lovely. If this mother was wanting to get rid of her baby, then at least he could go to a family that would adore him. A few days later, I got the call that I had been reported for child trafficking. The ice cream man had told someone that I was taking photos of the baby. I was obviously trying to sell him. It was things like this that were making me lose my sanity. The heat mainly, but with things like this on top of the heat, it was enough to send me loopy. Andrew was coming back from his time in Australia, and he couldn't be happier. He bought himself another motorbike. Funny how we seem to have enough money for certain luxuries. His first motor was good for trips to the market and dropping the girls at preschool, but it wasn't enough to satisfy his itch to explore Kampot. He bought this huge bike and he would ride around exploring. He would then come back and tell me how he rode up to the mountains around Kep, the village by the sea that we had visited when we first arrived in southern Cambodia. He would also ride up to Bokor, a resort on top of a mountain not far from us. It had been destroyed by the Khmer Rouge and was now in ruins. He also rode up Uterus Road and then make his way back up the hill to where a Chinese company was building a giant dam. It was a huge project. Andrew loved checking it all out. He was just so happy to be back, telling the kids how great it was to be away from Australia with all its rules. He hated it so much, hated feeling oppressed by the system. In Cambodia, there was none of that. He could do as he pleased. The only issue as far as he was concerned was us needing to make money. We had to generate some sort of funds in order to stay here. I had felt that our time was up in Cambodia for a while. I had tried to talk to Andrew about it. Now that he had been away for so long, I felt bad saying anything about it. It had been so hard for him in Australia, and he deserved some time in his utopia. I couldn't bring up the kids needing friends again. Surely he would see that for himself. It was so obvious by now. When we discussed ways of making an income that meant Andrew being able to stay home, we had come up with an idea of making our own coconut oil. I knew how amazing the stuff was from listening to my friend Naomi telling people about it at the Sterling Market while I gave people hand massages. Her dad, Dan, was trying so hard to sell the stuff, but was struggling to make Australians see how healthy it was. Things were changing, however. His coconut oil was now being sold all over Europe and the US. People were starting to take notice. More and more Aussies were buying it. It was still early days, but the message was getting through. What if we started producing it and sold it to tourists coming through Cambodia looking for an ethically made product? Could we do that? Would enough people want it? After lots of talking it through and emails back and forth with Dan and his company, Neolife, we felt that we could go ahead with our idea. I had admired Dan's integrity in the coconut oil production. It felt right to have him as our connection and buying the extractor from him. Cold-pressed coconut oil was a pretty simple concept. Grate the flesh out of the coconut, heat it up a little to dry it, but not enough to damage any of its nutrients. Then press it through an extractor and the oil would ooze out ready to be consumed. We quickly realized it was slightly trickier than that. We had rented the shack next door to us and fitted it out with a long brick bench. A small fire would be lit underneath, just enough flame to make the stainless steel plate on top warm through to heat the coconut. We started with getting the coconut shredded at the market, but realized it would be much better to shred it ourselves. We bought this crazy contraption that would grate a coconut in a matter of seconds and possibly make you lose a couple of fingers at the same time if you didn't pay attention. As it turned out, nothing is straightforward in Cambodia. We were surrounded by coconut trees, so the least of our worries was sourcing coconuts. It turned out that wasn't the case. We needed mature coconuts. The ones growing around us were mainly sold while still green. The amount of coconuts we needed would have to be imported from Vietnam. And no, they wouldn't be as cheap as we'd been told. Everyone wanted to profit from barangs trying to start a business. It was frustrating and slow. Andrew would keep trying different batches of oil, letting them sit for a few days to see if they had got the coconut dry enough to not have any moisture left in it. If it did, then the coconut oil would be cloudy and go rancid. If he dried it too much, the coconut oil was too dark and lost its healing properties. It was hard for Andrew. We had paid a lot of money for the espresso. We needed this to work. We didn't have a plan B for how to make a living in Cambodia. Andrew was becoming more and more frustrated. His patience was running low. He had already been giving Asher a hard time for a couple of years, but it was intensifying. Asher seemed to be an easy target for Andrew. He was jealous over the connection that Asher and I had. Andrew knew that each nasty comment to Asher hit me deep. He couldn't stop himself. I begged him to be more careful with what he said to Asher. It was taking its toll on my son. Andrew even acknowledged to me that he was doing it, but he didn't seem to be able to stop himself. Since Asher and Tikva were born, I had wanted to do something special for their coming-of-age birthdays. It was a Jewish tradition that really appealed to me. For boys, it was at 13, and for girls, 12. I loved the idea of acknowledging this really important milestone. I'd been mulling it over. I didn't want anything religious as such, but I did want the kids to have a before and after moment that they could look back on. I wanted the opportunity to talk to them about deeper things in life. I had always had a really good connection with them, and it felt right to do something special for the occasion. Asher's 13th birthday was coming up, and I really wanted Andrew and him to have a connecting experience together. I felt so sad about how things were going between them. To send them away together in a negative headspace was pretty confronting for me. I just had to set my worries aside and trust that Andrew would handle the situation with care. I knew that when he set his insecurities and pride aside, he could be the most wonderful dad I had ever hoped for my kids. He seemed keen to take Asher away. Andrew asked his friends to each give a letter to Asher about reaching manhood, write some things that they wished they had been told when they were approaching this important age. I was so grateful that Andrew hadn't shot the idea down when I suggested it to him, and thankfully his friends had come through. So many of them had taken the time to write to Asher, heartfelt letters. Even my brothers had done it. It meant a lot to me. My wish was that the guys who wrote these letters would over time become mentors to Asher, and he would feel as if he could approach them with concerns or issues. I loved that Asher had these letters to refer back to, and even though I didn't read them myself, I knew that the things written came from the heart. Along with the letters, Asher and Andrew went to Laos for an adventure. Once again, it was Ariella who had told us about this amazing place in the jungles of Laos. It was called the Gibbon Experience. Zip lines stretched for kilometers high above the jungle. Tree houses were built on stilts that connected each line. Andrew and Asher spent a few days speeding across the jungle sky, going from tree house to tree house. It was initially terrifying, but after a few goes, Asher could enjoy the thrill. It was a great experience, and the boys came back telling us of their adventures. Tikva knew that her time away with me was only 6 months down the track. Her 12th birthday was in October. I was going to surprise her with a trip to England and Sweden. I had found tickets online that would cost less than $1,000 for both of us to fly there and back. It was so cheap. Tikva had been asking me for years to go to Sweden. She couldn't remember being there as a toddler, but felt a connection to the place. For me, it was a chance to have her meet with women who were important to me from my childhood. It was a perfect way to celebrate her coming of age. I didn't want to tell her, though. I thought it would be an amazing surprise. I was thinking through how I could pull it off. We were going up to Phnom Penh for regular dental appointments with Asher. He was getting his teeth straightened with a retainer that needed regular tweaking. Andrew was completely opposed to our kids getting their teeth straightened, saying it was so unnecessary and vain. I disagreed. For me, it was really important. I had a retainer as a kid in Sweden, and having straight teeth was more than having a pretty smile. It meant dental hygiene. For Andrew, this was ridiculous, and he was happy to remind us that when he was offered braces as a teenager, he had refused. Why would we spend cash on something as shallow as that? I had eventually convinced him when I said that we could use the money from Paul's inheritance to pay for it. It meant regular trips to Phnom Penh, though, and I thought that on one of those trips in October, I would surprise Tikva and only tell her about it once the tuk-tuk got to the airport. It would be a wonderful surprise. Unfortunately, I couldn't wait that long. Tikva was struggling so much in Cambodia. My normally happy daughter was incredibly lethargic. She didn't want to leave the house. It felt as if she was walking through deep water, and I couldn't quite surface. I felt for her. I knew she needed more than what life in rural Cambodia could offer her. I decided to tell her about her 12th birthday present early. I asked her to just try to hold on to that, focus on the fact that she would have this wonderful trip in a few months. Could she do that? She promised me that she would try, and it seemed as if her mood improved somewhat. I felt incredibly stuck. Andrew had been away from his idyllic life in Cambodia, and he was needing to recharge his batteries in this lawless country. My kids, on the other hand, my older kids especially, were over it. Well and truly over it. My only solution was to try once again to find them some friends. I ended up getting in touch with a homeschooling UN family in Phnom Penh with similar-aged kids. Being homeschooled, they didn't seem to have that bratty expat attitude that we'd come across in our travels. Incredibly wealthy kids living the high life in Cambodia. They almost seemed like royalty. I knew it could happen so easily when you grow up with maids and cleaners and drivers and guards. Thankfully, this family was very different to that, and our kids got along straight away. Not only were they friendly, they were hospitable and desperate as us for friends. We got invited to extend our dental visits to Phnom Penh and spend the night at their house. We played in their pool for hours. We would share large spontaneous dinners with their family being as big as ours. Rosa would normally travel with us to Phnom Penh, and she got along with their helper, so it really was a perfect match. It was so overdue and exactly what our friendship-starved family needed. Once we were back in our village, it was hard to keep the kids in a positive frame of mind. I tried to tell Andrew that I was really concerned for them, but he seemed to think I was exaggerating. He was still very frustrated with the amount of time I spent online. For me, I needed both. I needed time during the day with the kids, but I also needed to connect with the rest of the world. In many ways, it became my sanity. I didn't have many friends that I could be with in Kampot. Everyone was busy with their own lives, and I tried as much as I could to invite people over for meals or ask if they wanted to join us down by the river. I really enjoyed spending time with Katie and Helen. Helen was often busy away on trips, helping Cambodians who were getting kicked off their land in the name of progress. Katie, as well as being a mother, was running Epic Arts. They often had their shack on the river full of young deaf people for a lunch and swim, and we would be invited to join in on the fun. I had a lot of respect for both Christy and Helen and the work they were doing in Cambodia. We would try to have cups of tea as often as their busy schedule would allow, and they would ask me all about parenting and feeling out of their depth in their new venture. It was so refreshing to see two people who were genuinely contributing to Cambodia but not living a lavish lifestyle. They were truly passionate about what they were involved in, and even though they could have easily cashed in on the attention they were getting, neither of them had. I wished I had more chances of catching up for cups of tea in their garden, but it was still a rare treat. Instead, I would escape into Facebook land in the evenings. It wasn't as if I was watching YouTube clips about cats. By now, I had quite a large group of people following our story. Srenet's older sister had just given birth. She had been one of my embroidery girls during the sewing project. I decided to go over and give her a gift for the occasion. They only lived a few meters down Uterus Road, opposite the noodle shack, in a mud pit. It was monsoon season, so I had to walk through a deep puddle to get to their tiny hut. I had never really had a close look before, but as I started climbing the rickety ladder, I was very much paying attention. It felt as if I was going to make the whole thing collapse, as if I was trying to get into one of the forts that Asher and Tikva used to build in Adelaide. It was held together with rusty metal, pieces of plywood, and palm branches. As I poked inside, I could see the new mother on the floor, her baby girl next to her, both of them wet from the rain that had poured in that night, the grandmother boiling something in a blackened tin, the smoke from the fire going into the hut. It was so tiny, so ridiculously tiny. I couldn't even imagine how they fit everyone in at night to sleep. 3 sisters, their mother, the new father of the baby, and of course the baby as well. There wasn't enough floor space for that many people. Summer had come with me, and she knelt down to kiss the baby girl. I remained by the door, hoping the shack wouldn't collapse from my weight. It was absolutely insane. A young mom having to live like this. I knew how going to the toilet is so delicate after birth. How did she get down the ladder and then wade in the deep puddle? Not just that, but both the mother and the baby were getting rained on. I had to do something. I asked Rosa to help me talk to a builder. How much would it cost to replace their shack with a proper structure? It would cost less than $1,000 and would only take a couple of days. Too easy. I got on Facebook and told my now big group of friends about what was happening. I showed a couple of photos of the shack we needed to replace. The money started to come in immediately. It was incredible. I went to tell Rosa that we had the money only a few hours after we had spoken to the builder. Instead of looking pleased, she seemed troubled. Word had spread about the home being replaced. Did I know that they were living on illegal land? The village chief would not approve of a structure going up there. He had turned a blind eye to this rickety shack, but even then had recently told the family that they would need to leave. Our road was going to be widened, and the space they were in would be swallowed up. Damn! It was so frustrating. This family needed somewhere to live that was permanent. The only solution was to buy them some land that they couldn't be kicked off. Rosa told me that we could buy a segment of a rice paddy close to her house. It was only a few hundred meters away from where this family lived, so they wouldn't feel disoriented. Buying land was more expensive than building a house, though. I didn't need to worry. Yet again, my Facebook friends came through. Within a couple of days, all the money needed for the land was covered. Incredible. Friends who I hadn't heard from in years, friends who I knew struggled financially. It felt so good to know that all these people around the world were understanding how critical it was for this family to have a home. While their house was being built and the rain was pouring down, I invited them into our home. They seemed somewhat terrified at the concept of living with us, but I assured them through Rosa that they could still cook their food on an open fire and they didn't need to use the rest of the house if they didn't want to. They could all just snuggle up in our smallest room and pretend they were home. And they did. Because of the heavy rain, it took longer than expected, but after 2 weeks, this little family finally had a home, a proper home. Rosa told me that they wouldn't need a chicken with a sink. They would be able to cook their meals under the house. I was trying to find things to do with Asher and Tikva to keep their minds off how lonely they were. I had been suggesting a bike ride for a while. I wanted to show them the places that Sarah and I would ride on Sunday mornings. Asher was keen, but Tikva seemed hesitant. I couldn't quite figure out why. Eventually she agreed. We rode past the submerged rice paddies, past huts and kids waving to us and asking us what our names were, past temples and salt fields. I was so happy to finally get Tikva out of the house. Just as we were finishing our adventure, we had to cross a road, the highway coming into Kampot. As I crossed, I could see Tikva following me. Assuming it was safe to cross, when I crossed, it wasn't. Just a couple of seconds of delay meant that a speeding motor crashed right into her. I saw her fly off her bicycle and skid across the road. At the same time, the motor toppled to the ground and 2 monks went flying into the air, their orange robes unraveling as they came crashing down. It was surreal. I looked over at Tikva. I couldn't believe that we hadn't been hit by an oncoming truck. Normally, there was one every few seconds at this time of day. We had somehow managed to have all this happen in some sort of truck lull. Once I got Tikva off the road, I checked her for injuries. She had skid across the road, yet I couldn't see any marks on her body. I kept checking. She was shaking and crying. I could see the monks in their tiny undergarments that looked like women's slips. They were standing in the middle of the road, gathering meters of fabric in their arms. A crowd of onlookers were now surrounding us, all the traffic stopping to look at the Barang family. It was such a close call. I couldn't believe that Tikva was unharmed. Her only injury was a sore wrist. How could she have landed like that and not be hurt? It took me and Asher a few days to stop asking each other. The trip to Sweden couldn't come fast enough. Tikva was counting the days until she could get on a plane. The trip turned out to be so much more than we could have hoped for. We spent a week in England with my cousin, who I hadn't seen since I was a child, who knew that we were so connected. I felt as if I was with a long-lost sister. In fact, she almost felt more than a sister. We had the same humor, the same intensity. Her poor husband just shook his head as there were 2 of us. One was more than enough. We were giddy with joy at being together. Tikva was lapping it up. She loved seeing me so happy, but it was more than that. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We spent a few days with my teachers from my school in Jerusalem. Miss Johnson was now Amanda. Last memory I had of her was my brother Raphael throwing her into a pool at high school graduation. Now she was a vicar and totally spoiling us as she took us around London to see the sights. A ferry ride to Greenwich Village, where we stumbled across Sherlock Holmes being filmed. A day at a castle. Tikva loved anything medieval, and this was the ultimate outing for her. We then went off to Oxford, where we got to spend time with my favorite teacher from school, Miss Fail, who I now had to call Helen. I had adored her in high school. She was kind and seemed to understand me more than any other teachers did. It was great to see her after so many years. We didn't get as much time with her as we did with Miss Johnson, but we made the most of it. I was thrilled to have her give me her book about third culture kids. After finishing teaching in Jerusalem, she had furthered her studies and now had a doctorate on the topic. I love that. The more that we researched about this growing breed of people who didn't really belong in any culture, the better. We then flew to Sweden for Tikva to finally spend some time there. It was so good to see my mother again. She lived a very short bike ride away from where I had moved to when I was 7. She even worked at the school that I had gone to with Johanna all those years before. The 2 of us walking around feeling proud about our ugly clothes because it meant we were going to heaven. Now the building had been converted into a school for adults, immigrants mainly, teaching them Swedish so they could find jobs quicker. My mother was a counselor there, doing so much more than her job description asked for, inviting lonely immigrants to her home, baking for their special occasions, bringing them gifts when they had babies. They loved her for being so kind and warm. I had always marveled at people who still lived in the same city that they were born in. For me, it was incredible to be able to build layers of memories in the same place. I had never experienced anything like that. We only had a couple of days with my mother, but we were able to go down to Falsterbo and walk through the beautiful graveyard where Mormon and Morfar were buried. We could hear the sound of the waves crashing in as we placed shells on their memorial stone. In the evening, Tikva cooked with her grandma, something so rare and so precious. I longed for my kids to have rituals with their grandparents, so deeply sad that my children had missed out on priceless childhood memories. One of the surprises I had for Tikva was that I had asked all the women in my life that I respected to write a letter for her. I had the letters bound together, so on her actual birthday evening, I presented her with the book. The cover was a beautiful mandala that my friend Beck had drawn for her. As well as that, I had asked if each person that we were going to visit could spend some time with Tikva cooking one of their favorite recipes that had a bit of a story attached. I would then make her another book that included all the recipes as well as the stories, and maybe even a photo of Tikva and this woman cooking together. It was simple, but it gave our trip a bit of a storyline. We then caught a train to see my sister Susanna and her kids for a weekend. Again, a miniature visit, but so worthwhile. Seeing my nephew and niece, now fluent in Swedish and English, was so wonderful. Another train trip, and we got to see my friend Johanna, now a mother of 3, still a force to be reckoned with. She was now working in a school, trying to empower immigrant students by encouraging them to become political activists instead of using violence as a way to be heard. Many of them had been living in oppressed countries where violence was their form of communication. It didn't have to be like that in Sweden. Racial tensions were increasing in southern Sweden, and Johanna felt that so much of it could be avoided if these immigrants were able to gain a voice in the political realm. It was working. Her pilot program had just received funds so it could be introduced to other schools across Sweden. I was so proud of her. Our next stop was Gothenburg. We had Swedish friends who had lived in Adelaide for a couple of years that had returned home. Their house backed onto a forest. Tikva and her friend Siri would be gone all day. They would come in once it got dark, their faces flushed by the excitement. Stories of getting stuck in deep mud, pretending to be running away from an orphanage, finding berries and mushrooms. The two of them were so similar and they were bursting with excitement. Who was this girl? I hardly recognized my daughter. Tikva was pleading to stay out longer. She didn't care if it was dark. She was dirty from sliding down boulders, a shoe missing, apparently still stuck in deep mud. I looked at her and realized that she was still a little girl. A little girl desperate to have fun, so starved of play. She begged to stay. Could she please live with Siri and her family? She didn't want to go back to Cambodia. She begged me. I couldn't believe how ignorant I was. I had assumed that a lot of her wanting to stay indoors was her getting older and hitting puberty. I knew that was common in those in-between years. I was so wrong, so utterly wrong. Tikva was still a kid, desperate to squeeze some more years out of her childhood. I could see the desperation in her eyes. Mama, please let me stay here. Tears rolling down her face. I knew it was too much to ask his family to host my daughter, who had just turned 12 for a few days earlier. She needed her mama. She needed her mama to stop worrying about pulling Andrew away from his utopia. She needed her mama to put her kids' needs first. I promised Tikva I would talk to her dad. I didn't know what I would do, but I would talk to him. We then caught another train to Uppsala. Our friends Ting and Danny now live there. It was Ting's mother that I had met at the Central Markets in Adelaide when I was selling bread all those years ago. Both Tikva and I adore them, and we were excited to see what their life in Sweden looked like. We felt as if we'd stepped into an Astrid Lindgren book. Their red house, their barn, their giant apple tree. It was an idyllic spot, and we soaked up our few days with them. Ting was still able to paint despite having 3 boys to look after. She had always been amazing like that, being able to create art in the midst of chaos. Danny was busy writing another book. I had lost count. Was this his 3rd? I was pretty sure that when I first met him, he was just about to finish his first book. The one he was writing sounded fascinating, telling his story of driving to Poland with his dad and oldest son to find a treasure that his grandfather had spoken about his entire childhood. They had escaped Nazi Europe. Danny was raised in Sweden as a Jew. We spent many evenings laughing at how similar the characters in our families seemed, but despite them living on opposite sides of the globe. That Jewish anxiety and hyper-caution, especially around food and new experiences, respected no boundaries. We seemed to share the same aunties and grandparents. Tikva spent most of her time picking apples or riding a bike down to the forest. I pretty much spent the whole visit sitting at their kitchen table talking to whoever happened to sit down next to me. How were they able to attract such fascinating friends? The conversations were vibrant. So many different languages spoken, cups of tea being refilled as breakfast became lunch and lunch became dinner. The one character that stood out the most to me that visit was a friend of theirs who was an asylum seeker from Iran. He had lived in Sweden for 7 years. His Swedish was almost fluent. Only a slight accent gave him away. He was working as a teacher at a school, helping immigrant kids absorb into Swedish culture. He told me that he and his brother had fled Iran at the same time, both fearing for their lives. They were separated along the way. His brother ended up in Australia. 7 years later, he was still in detention, still locked up, still waiting to hear if Australia would accept him as a genuine refugee. This man, on the other hand, who landed in Sweden, only spent 3 weeks waiting to be processed. He needed to sleep in the accommodation provided for him, but was able to come and go as he pleased. He was never treated as a criminal. He was able to start learning Swedish straight away. He was now earning money as a teacher and contributing back to the country that had welcomed him. How different to the men that I had helped teach English outside Adelaide. The years they spent being imprisoned, how they were traumatized from their experience. One of them even committing suicide not long after being told he had to return to Afghanistan. How could they be treated so differently in the two countries? My heart ached for this man's brother, and I felt such shame for my adopted country. We arrived back in Phnom Penh and had hardly put our suitcases down when Tikva burst out crying. Not just crying, but hyperventilating. She was having a panic attack. It went on for ages. I wrapped her in a blanket and just cradled her. She would try to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. A couple of hours later, when she finally settled with her head in my lap, she started to speak between the sobs. She couldn't live in Cambodia anymore. She just couldn't. Even the trip from the airport to the guest house had been too much. It had brought everything back. She hated it here. She hated it for so long. She had tried to like it because she knew it was important for me and Dad, but she couldn't pretend anymore. She was pleading with me. I just want to be a girl, Mama. I just want to be a girl. They look at me as if I'm a grown-up. I'm only 12. They think I'm a woman. I had no idea. I hadn't even considered it. Tikva was tiny. In Australia, she was often mistaken for someone 2 or 3 years younger than her actual age. But she was right. In Cambodia, she was the size of a grown woman. Rosa was only a tiny bit taller than Tikva, and her body was smaller. No wonder men were looking at Tikva. No wonder she hadn't wanted to leave our house. No wonder she'd become a kid as soon as we landed in England and then in Sweden. She had disappeared into the forest with her friend Siri. She was a kid, a little kid with men ogling her. She had done what I had asked her. More than 6 months earlier, I had asked her to hold on until we went on our trip to Sweden. And she had. It had taken everything in her, but somehow she had held on. Now she had tasted the freedom of being a kid for a month, and arriving back to the reality was too much. I knew our chapter in Cambodia was up. I had known for a long time, but I had tried to push the thought away. It was too hard to face. I also knew that Andrew would be devastated. For me, the idea of suburbia was terrifying. As much as I struggled with the heat and the annoying habits of the locals who saw me and the kids as endless entertainment, it was still better than suburbia. Starting and ending my day in a car, library finds, mindless comments about the weather. For Veronica, there was nothing worse. But in this moment, I had to be a mother. I couldn't base my decision on what Veronica wanted. And anyway, I couldn't do what I wanted to do in Cambodia at the same time as being a mother. It just didn't work. Someone had to miss out, and unfortunately in Cambodia, that would be my kids. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. We had to go back to suburbia. The reality was starting to sink in as Tikva continued to lay in my lap, the occasional sobs still coming to the surface. I needed to talk to Andrew. I needed to let him know our time was up. Andrew had started a new job not long before we left on our trip to Sweden. After almost 2.5 years, Andrew had been employed to work in Cambodia. No more trips to Australia. The only issue was, of course, that the job was based in Phnom Penh and often required him to go out to the countryside for a few days at a time. It was a dream job for Andrew, just not for the rest of us. I was happy that he'd had this opportunity, but reminded him that having his family in a village in southern Cambodia while he spent the weekdays in Phnom Penh and beyond was not in any way fulfilling our desire to spend more time together as a family. Andrew reminded me that it would be too expensive to live in Phnom Penh as a family, and I reminded him that I would never want to live in Phnom Penh, even if we had the money. And no, me living in our village with the kids for the week was not the solution. Andrew was coming back exhausted on the Friday and then leaving Sunday night to start his week in Phnom Penh on Monday morning. It was nuts. How long was he expecting us to survive like this with this new setup that obviously suited him perfectly and scared the shit out of me? When was he going to understand that my nerves were not coping with us living apart? We decided that we would talk about it properly when he came up with the rest of the kids the next day. We paid for the big kids, which included Rosa, to watch a movie while the little girls played in an indoor playground. It was our one chance to talk. I was totally straight with Andrew. I explained again what had happened with Tikva, explained that this had been going on for a while now, that we needed to act, and we needed to act soon. Andrew agreed that Cambodia was no longer best for our older kids, that they needed to feel safe. They needed to feel normal. He knew it was best for them to leave, but where exactly was I suggesting? Andrew knew that I'd been Googling places to live in Australia for a while. On one of our trips, we had flown to Queensland for 2 nights to check out a commune. Was I suggesting there? He knew I'd been searching for the place in Australia that was the most bike-friendly, so we didn't need to base our life around our car. My search had come back with options that just wouldn't work for us. We would need a place that could provide a job for Andrew, and I was thinking that I might have to go get some study done to upgrade my much-neglected counseling degree. I couldn't expect to get work with my empty resume. I knew Andrew was opposed to me volunteering at a school, but maybe he would be more open-minded about me studying. Even if it was just 1 day a week. I had spent so many nights lying awake trying to think of what options we had if we ever did move back. I always came back to the same thing. Our kids needed family. They needed relatives. They needed to belong. The only place that even remotely offered that was Melbourne, a city I really knew nothing about. I had been to St. Kilda a couple of times and to the aquarium. That was it. I could probably get used to liking the hippie market half an hour away from where Andrew grew up. That was all I knew about Melbourne, except the glaring truth that it was the only place in Australia that we had family. Andrew's dad and sister. Not a huge amount, but it was a start. Andrew was horrified when I told him. Melbourne? Why would we ever move there? He was shocked. I explained to him about our kids belonging somewhere, and it wouldn't just happen without relatives. We had learnt the hard way in Adelaide. Andrew was furious. To him, the only option was Adelaide. He wanted to be with his friends. If he had to live a miserable life in Australia, the least I could give him was his friends in Adelaide. I couldn't bite my tongue anymore. He was acting like a spoiled teenager. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about me. This was about the kids. If we were making a decision based on them, there was no other choice but Melbourne. He wanted to know where I was suggesting we live. I reminded him that we owned a house in Melbourne, a 4-bedroom house that we had picked based on something we could consider living in if we ever needed to. Both of us hoping it would never come to that. We could live there. Andrew thought I was kidding. It's the worst house ever. It's pokey. It's in the most boring part of Melbourne. The rooms are so small. His list went on forever. This was ridiculous. The house was fine, totally fine. It had a great view. If anything, it was me who had said when we bought it that if we ever did move in, we would want to change the flooring. The beige tiles were awful, and the worn-out carpet was a horrible dusty pink. That would have to go. It was me who'd been complaining about it. 2.5 years in Cambodia had changed all that. I couldn't care less about the beige tiles anymore. The carpet was no problem. It was a house, our house. It had showers with actual pressure to them. No more risk of being electrocuted from dodgy wiring. Yes, the area seemed boring, but our kids would have a grandpa and an auntie. Surely we could overlook some beige things in exchange for that. I could feel Andrew's rage. He knew it was the right decision, but he just couldn't get past the fact that he felt forced into it by me. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Andrew was still working during the week, but would come home on the weekends. I wasn't scared of him, but I kept my distance. His loathing for me was palpable. I had done the unforgivable. I was forcing him away from his utopian life in lawless Cambodia. We had so many things that needed to be done, and it was hard to talk to Andrew about them with his anger so close to the surface. I let him know that my friend was happy to lend us some money to help us pay for the trip home. I hadn't seen her since I lived in Portland as a teenager, but here she was sending me messages on Facebook telling me to get the hell out of that jungle. She was the one of the few people who I'd opened up to about how bad it had become. I didn't feel as if it was something I could share freely. It was too woven into the complexity of our marriage. She understood my desperation, though, and told us that she would transfer money across ASAP. My mother helped us as well, so relieved that we were going back to Australia. Andrew's dad was helping us out as well. It meant a lot that we had these people stepping up at such a delicate time. Andrew had got every job he applied for in Australia. He was incredibly good at being an engineer, and it was pretty obvious in his interviews that he would be an asset to any company that hired him. Within a very short amount of time, he landed a job with Ford in Melbourne. He could start in the new year. Our tenants agreed to move out. We had dreaded asking them, but they were hoping to find something a bit cheaper anyways, so the timing was actually good for them. That had been our biggest hurdle. Pretty much everything was in place. We only had a few more weeks to go. Our tickets were booked for December 20th, 2011. We would arrive back just before Christmas. In the meantime, we had to pack up our house and celebrate the girls' birthdays. I wasn't sure how we would make it all happen since it was an enormous job to get our house packed. We didn't want to bring a lot of things back to Australia, but we still needed to sort out all our belongings and declutter. It really was a mammoth task. I ended up asking Rosa to spread the word in our village that anything that we put on the porch was free to take. I had already allocated the bigger items to Rosa and Strainette's family. We didn't have anything of value, but for them our $7 wicker bookshelves were a treasure. We had so many to give away that each family member could have their own set of shelves. Not just that, but our thin mattresses as well. These cheap foam mattresses that were starting to go moldy from the humidity were welcomed with open arms. Rosa wanted the bed linen and the kitchen utensils. I told them it would be handed over on our last night. It felt so good to get rid of our stuff. Once most of our belongings were gone, I tried to map out our last few days there. I still had some money left over from Tikva's and Violet's 3 jars full venture. I had been trying to think of something we could do for the 2 families I felt were the most desperate in our village. Strainette's family, who now had their house, as well as Rosa's cousin, who was struggling with her little boy, and her husband, who wouldn't share the money he earned while away. I had been asking about this for a while and finally decided to go ahead and buy them each a calf. It was the closest you could come to being financially secure in rural Cambodia. It meant money for the future. It was the ultimate thing to own. It wouldn't cost so much to impregnate the cow once she was old enough, and then they could sell off each calf that was born. And the manure could be used to grow vegetables. I knew how much cow owners in our village loved their cows. We often had a young man spend a few hours in our backyard chopping grass for his beloved cow. At night, a small fire was made to keep the mosquitoes away. These cows would eventually bring a lot of money into a family if they took care of her and made sure she didn't get sick. I had started using the same taxi driver for my trips to Phnom Penh. He had a winning combo of speaking English as well as having a seatbelt for each of his passengers. He promised me that he would find me a couple of calves, and he did. It wasn't as straightforward as I had hoped, but after a few visits, we finally had the money paid and we were promised the calves would be delivered the next day. It was a big occasion, and I asked the village chief to take part in the proceedings. I wanted the new cow owners to really understand that I was serious about what I said. I figured that maybe with the village chief as witness, they would go ahead and act on my wishes. My only request from them was that the second female calf that was born from their own cow, they would give to a family who was poorer than them. No payment, just a gift. And they would be told to do the same thing once that calf grew up. The idea I had was that if this actually worked, there would be a lot more cow owners a few years down the track in southern Cambodia. It was my attempt at a long-term plan, possibly my only long-term plan ever. I really wanted it to work. The village chief seemed to like the idea. So did my taxi driver. They were busy holding hands while watching the calves being untied from the back of a moto. I tried not to cringe at how roughly these poor calves were being treated. I tried to focus on the fact that they were still alive after traveling upside down on the back of a moto all the way down Uterus Road. My taxi driver had picked strong cows. I knew Andrew was really struggling with this move, and I was trying to think of something nice he could do before we had to leave. I suggested he take the kids to Rabbit Island for a night. It would not only be great for them to have one last visit there, but it would also give me a chance to get some cleaning done with no kids in the house. The electricity wasn't working, which meant no DVDs to distract the kids with, as well as no fans, which made it extra hot. It would have made sense for Rosa to stay with me and help clean the house. After all, she was technically our maid. Instead, I decided that it was probably her last chance to go to Rabbit Island, at least for a long time. I doubted that her new employers would be as kind to her as we had been. The likelihood of her having time away like that seemed pretty far-fetched. I was happy to wave them all off on a tuk-tuk as I got back to cleaning the house on my own and cursing the fans for not working. I received a text from Andrew the next day. They were having such a great time, they would stay a bit longer. It was so good to hear anything remotely positive from Andrew. I told him to enjoy his time away. I stayed at the house, part of me wondering if Rosa would return to help me with the packing and cleaning. I knew there was going to be a lunar eclipse that night, and I had pictured sharing the moment with my family. Instead, I walked through the streets of Kampot, something I never did. I was always on a bike or a tuk-tuk. It felt so different to walk. I sat down to watch the eclipse that was about to begin. This was new for me. I never really paid attention to the moon. Sometimes I would notice that it was full, or that it was now low on the horizon, or think to myself that a crescent was almost more beautiful than a full moon. There was something about giving it my full attention. It tapped into a part of me that I didn't recognize. As I watched the eclipse slowly take place, I wondered what my life would look like the next full moon. It seemed too crazy to even think about me back in Australia, far, far away from Kampot. As I continued sitting there, I had this eerie feeling that it wasn't so much about me sitting there looking at the moon. In fact, it felt as if the moon was looking down at me. All of a sudden, I could see me from the moon's perspective. This woman, sitting in the middle of a road, the tiny town around her, the river not far away, behind the river, the beautiful mountain, then the rice paddies stretching off into the horizon with the occasional sharp mountain peak poking out. In that moment, it was just me and the moon, me and the Cambodian landscape stretching around me. The moon was now completely hidden. I thought about Andrew. I knew he'd be watching the moon as well. Rosa would be with him. Probably Asher and Tikva as well. The girls hopefully asleep, exhausted from 2 days of playing in the ocean. I loved knowing that they were all enjoying themselves. It had been a hard couple of days cleaning the house, but I had made the right decision. Andrew had already sent me a text to say that they were extending their visit yet again. They must be having a really good time. What a relief. All I longed for was harmony for my family, meaning for myself, and a better life for others. Our time in Cambodia was over. Melbourne was waiting. I looked up to the silhouette of the moon, wondering if she knew what lay ahead. What would our next chapter have in store? I was dreading returning to Australia, yet longing for our family to have a fresh start with support finally around us. My heart ached at wanting to keep helping those less fortunate, yet it would have to be done from suburbia so that my children's needs could come first. I had tried so hard, and I just needed to trust that better things were on the horizon.